On my birthday, my daughter decided to travel to the beach with her husband and mother-in-law. When she handed me the dog licenses I had given her myself, she said the words that sealed her fate: "You're not going. Deal with those mutts yourself." I spent my birthday alone with the dogs, but the sadness quickly gave way to cold clarity. The next day, as expected, my phone rang. It was her, shouting, "What did you do with the cards? We couldn't pay for anything." She thought the humiliation ended there, but my response left her terrified. My name is James, and today, at 72, I carry my life not as a burden, but as a book of memories, some pages torn, others rewritten with the invisible ink of time. That day, my birthday, began with the promise of a new chapter, but ended with the most painful of epilogues. The smell of fresh coffee, ground just moments before, mingled with the sweet aroma of the blueberry muffins I had baked myself. A familiar olfactory melody that, for years, had been the soundtrack to my Saturday mornings. It was a ritual, an attempt to fill the silence that, since the passing of my beloved wife, had become a permanent guest in every room. I clung to that routine with the strength of a drowning man to the last piece of driftwood, awaiting the arrival of my only daughter, my son-in-law, and my four-legged grandchildren. They were my breath of fresh air, the hope that warmed my chest on cold days. I had chosen each of those dogs with a care that bordered on devotion, gifts given to my daughter over the years, not just as pets, but as silent teachers. I wanted her to learn about loyalty, about the unconditional love that blossoms without asking for anything in return, something I foolishly still believed she would value. There was Biscuit, a golden Labrador with an ever-gentle gaze; Honey, a small beagle with contagious energy; Duke, a robust German shepherd; my faithful protector; and Princess, a miniature terrier, delicate and full of charm. They were my family, a piece of myself I had entrusted to her. The house, once so empty, reverberated with my anticipation. The morning sun streamed through the living room window, painting the hardwood floor with golden stripes, and I caught myself smiling, imagining the joyful barks, the tight hugs, the blessed chaos they would bring. Then the doorbell rang, a sound that, in the blink of an eye, would turn all that expectation to ash. I hurried to the door, a wide smile on my face, my heart pounding with the contained joy of a father awaiting his daughter. But when the heavy wood swung open, it wasn't for a warm embrace, nor for the barks and euphoria of the dogs. No, it was to hand me 4 leashes, one for each of my grandchildren, and a stab to the heart that I still feel reverberating in my soul. My daughter, Megan, stood there, a shadow on the threshold, with her husband, Philip, and his mother, Sylvia, behind her, their suitcases already in the car, ready for departure. The smile on my face withered, the joy vanished like sand slipping through my fingers. "Dad, we've had a change of plans," Megan said, her voice hurried, almost cold, as she held out the leashes to me. Her eyes, once so full of life, seemed distant, opaque. We're going to spend the weekend at the beach house with my husband's family." The air left my lungs, leaving me breathless, as if an invisible weight had been dropped on my chest. Her family, the one for which there was no longer room for me, on my birthday. My eyes fixed on the leashes, then on the dogs, who stared at me with painful confusion, their tails wagging tentatively, as if they sensed the storm that was brewing. A pang of pain tore through me. Her family, an invisible barrier that excluded me. Seeing the pain etched on my face, she added the words that broke something inside me forever, words that became a bitter echo in my mind. "You're not coming. You deal with these mutts." Mutts. My dogs, my loyal companions, reduced to such a disdainful term. Philip and Sylvia just watched, impassive, their faces like masks of indifference. Not a word of apology, not a gesture of affection. Nothing. Just the heavy silence of an accepted abandonment I could never have imagined. My vision blurred, but I wouldn't let the tears fall. The humiliation was too deep to be displayed, and with that, she was gone, leaving me alone at the door, with 4 leashes dangling from my trembling hand and 4 pairs of confused eyes staring at me, full of a loyalty her own daughter did not possess. Biscuit, Honey, Duke, and Princess, the only ones who remained. That night, the house, once full of expectation, was now heavy with a piercing loneliness. I shared my blueberry muffins with the dogs, their soft muzzles brushing against my hand, their gentle licks a silent comfort in the midst of the storm of emotions that overwhelmed me. The sadness, deep and overwhelming, gave way to something new, something I hadn't felt in a long time. A steely determination, cold and relentless, began to form in my chest. I had built an empire, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice, with a single purpose: to give her everything. Now that same empire would be my tool, and I would use every penny, every ounce of influence, every piece of knowledge I possessed to teach her a lesson about the true value of things, about the consequences of her choices, and about the weight of the love she had so easily discarded. The game, I knew, had only just begun, and I was determined to play it to the end, whatever the cost. So she would understand that there are things in life that money can't buy, nor abandonment can erase. She would soon discover that I was not just a father, but a man who, when provoked, could move mountains. However, what she didn't know was that my next move would be just the first in a series of checks, each calculated to dismantle her comfort zone and force her to confront the reality she so desperately avoided. The shocked silence that would follow would be the first crack in the armor of arrogance she had built. The next morning brought a cold breeze that seemed to carry the weight of the previous night. I had slept little, the images of Megan's departure replaying like an old, worn-out film in my mind. The dogs, however, seemed to have sensed the shift. Biscuit lay at my feet for most of the night, his warm body a small comfort. Honey, Duke, and Princess, though more restless, sought my touch and voice with a persistence that reminded me of the purity of affection. The silence of the house was no longer the same. It was now punctuated by occasional barks, sighs, and the soft breathing of my new, or I should say renewed, companions. It was a less empty solitude, inhabited by a presence that, even without words, spoke louder than many speeches. As I prepared a strong pot of coffee, not just for myself, but also for the dogs, who watched me with expectant eyes, the phone rang. The sound, vibrant and insistent, was almost like an alarm, pulling me from my melancholic stupor. I glanced at the caller ID. It was Megan. A wave of conflicting emotions hit me: surprise, a foolish pang of hope that perhaps there was remorse, and a growing anticipation. I took a deep breath, set my mug on the counter, and answered, my voice as calm as a lake on a windless morning. "Hello?" What I heard on the other end of the line, however, was not an apology, nor a hint of regret. It was Megan's voice, transformed into a scream of uncontrolled fury, a torrent of words that hit me like stones. "What did you do to the cards? The payment for the resort was declined. We can't pay for anything." The sound of her voice, so full of indignation, without a shred of concern for what had happened the day before, only solidified the determination I had forged in the darkness of the night. There was no room for remorse in her, only outrage at her disrupted plans. With the calm of someone who has just made a definitive decision, a strange and resolute peace, I replied, each word carefully chosen, laden with a meaning that she, at that moment, could not grasp. "My dear, I've simply adjusted my finances to reflect my new family reality. You have your husband and his mother to support you. I have the dogs." The sentence, simple in its construction, carried a weight I felt reverberate through the line. I wasn't just cutting off the flow of money, I was marking territory, redefining ties, and above all, proclaiming that my worth no longer depended on her acceptance or presence. The shocked silence on the other end of the line was the first crack in her armor of arrogance, a sound that, to me, was more eloquent than any shout. It was the sound of shock, of disbelief, of the dawning realization that the world, which she believed revolved around her desires, had suddenly stopped. They didn't know, of course, that I hadn't just cancelled her supplementary cards. I had suspended the generous allowance that sustained the lavish lifestyle she and Philip led, a lifestyle that I, in my paternal blindness, had fueled for years. It was an empire of comfort that I had built, and which now, with a simple phone call, I was beginning to dismantle. Her fury was palpable, even from a distance. The conversation ended abruptly with a sharp click of the phone. I set the receiver aside and returned to the kitchen, feeling a mix of sadness and a bitter satisfaction. It wasn't revenge for revenge's sake, but a desperate attempt to shake the reality of someone I loved, but who seemed to have lost her way. As I bent down to stroke Duke's head, who was pressing his muzzle against my leg, I felt a shiver. Their revenge, I knew, would not be long in coming, and it would be of a very different, perhaps crueler nature. They had other weapons, those that wound not the wallet, but one's reputation, one's good name, the image built over a lifetime. I could feel it in the air, an invisible tension beginning to envelop me. I knew the ground was being prepared for a battle that would be fought not in the courts, but on social media, in whispers and assumptions. The digital world was a battlefield I barely understood, but I knew of its destructive power. What they were planning, I couldn't predict, but the certainty that it was coming was as solid as the promise of a new day. As the sun continued to rise in the sky, illuminating my now dog-filled home, I braced myself for the next stage of this silent confrontation, which would affect not only me, but also the way I was seen by those who, for a lifetime, I had tried to protect. The calm before the storm was an omen, and I knew I had to be ready for what was to come. The days following that bitter phone call sank into a strange calm, a deceptive quiet that precedes a storm. I dedicated myself to the dogs with a renewed passion, as if they were the precious links connecting me to reality, to true love. Biscuit, Honey, Duke, and Princess became the center of my universe, their presence filling every corner of the house and my heart. Long walks in the park, games in the backyard, and even the simple task of preparing their meals became moments of deep connection. In their loyal eyes, I found a reflection of affection I had forgotten could exist in such purity. However, this bubble of peace was destined to burst, and the trigger, as I had predicted, would come from the digital world, a terrain as alien to me as the moon. I was never one for social media, preferring the warmth of a face-to-face conversation or the quiet of a good book. My daughter, however, lived for online validation, for the image of perfection she meticulously curated. It was through my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, a curious lady always attuned to the neighborhood happenings, that the first barbs began to hit. Mrs. Peterson, with her usual kindness but a glint of concern in her eyes, came to my door with her tablet in hand, hesitating before showing me what she had found. "James, my dear, I'm so sorry, but I think you need to see this." On the screen, photos from Meghan and Philip's beach trip were displayed with cruel irony. Idyllic beaches, forced smiles, and captions that, at first glance, seemed innocent, but to me read like sharp razors. "Overcoming hardship," said one, under a photo of Meghan hugging Philip, both looking toward the horizon. Another, "Family united in challenging times," showed Philip's mother, Sylvia, laughing with them at a lavish table. The lowest blow, however, was in the subtext. The indirect jabs about controlling parents who can't accept their children's happiness and those who prefer isolation to the joy of their loved ones. The narrative that I was a bitter, jealous old man began to spread subtly, insidiously among friends and family. I felt a wave of nausea, not because of the lie itself, but because of the coldness with which my daughter was willing to distort reality, to tarnish my name to justify her own cruelty. My closest friends, those who truly knew me, like Dr. Evans, my longtime physician, and Mrs. Rodriguez, who helped me around the house, didn't believe such nonsense. But the outer circle, the acquaintances, those who feed on gossip, seemed ready to swallow every word. The digital poison was spreading, and I felt powerless to stop it, as I was not a player on that board. While the virtual drama unfolded like a distasteful play, staged for an eager audience, I was facing a real crisis, one that demanded my full attention and truly kept me up at night. Princess, the smallest of the dogs, my delicate miniature terrier, was listless. Her gaze, usually so bright and full of life, was now cloudy, and she refused to eat. Her body, once so light and agile, felt heavy, feverish to my touch. My heart tightened in a knot of panic. Megan's charade paled in comparison to the fragility of that small life. I immediately took her to Dr. Miller, the neighborhood veterinarian, a middle-aged man with a calm gaze and steady hands, who had always treated my animals with care and respect. As he examined Princess with a gentleness that reassured me, I watched his every move, every expression, searching for any sign, any hope. He palpated her small body, listened to her chest, and after a few minutes that felt like hours, he looked at me with a seriousness that made me fear the worst. "Mr. James, she has a severe infection." The diagnosis was a shock, a punch to the gut, a severe infection caused by ongoing neglect, which would require expensive and intensive treatment. Dr. Miller, a discreet man of few words, lowered his voice and, with a look of regret, mentioned something that chilled my blood. "I had already warned your daughter about the necessary care, Mr. James, months ago, about the importance of keeping her vaccinations up to date and of regular dental hygiene, which can lead to serious problems if neglected." Those words, spoken with a veiled sadness, were a punch to the gut. Months ago, it meant Megan and Philip were aware of the risk but had ignored the warnings, too busy with their own lives of luxury and frivolity. The anger I felt was not for myself, but for Princess, for her innocence and her silent pain. Their neglect wasn't just emotional, it was physical, tangible, with painful consequences for a defenseless creature. As I held Princess's trembling paw, I promised myself that I would not let this injustice go unanswered, that this little suffering life would not be in vain. The image of Princess struggling, her eyes full of pain, contrasted brutally with the photos of Megan smiling on the beach, oblivious to it all. The hypocrisy was so glaring it hurt. At that moment, it wasn't just about a lesson for Megan. It was about justice, about honor, about a commitment to those who cannot defend themselves. But life, as always, had more twists in store. The true test of my resolve was about to arrive, a challenge that would present itself in a way I could never have imagined. My concern for Princess dominated my thoughts, eclipsing the fury Megan's posts had awakened. The day after Dr. Miller's diagnosis, the little terrier seemed a bit more lively, a sign that the treatment was beginning to work. My relief was palpable, but the shadow of their neglect hung over me. It was a constant reminder of the depth of the chasm that had opened between my daughter and me. While I was absorbed in caring for Princess, a manila envelope, bearing the letterhead of a law firm, arrived in the mail. Its weight and the formality of its contents sent a chill down my spine. I opened it with slightly trembling hands. What I found inside was not a plea, not a request for reconciliation, but a legal notice. My eyes scanned the cold, legalistic words, each term a calculated blow. Megan and Philip, likely advised by the cunning Sylvia, were formally accusing me of misappropriation of property, the dogs. The same mutts my daughter had handed over with such disdain were now described in the document as show dogs of inestimable value. They demanded their immediate return and substantial compensation for emotional damages. The absurdity of the accusation left me speechless. A bitter laugh caught in my throat. It was hypocrisy in its most shameless form, a cynical attempt to turn their own negligence into a weapon against me. I felt a surge of anger, not just for myself, but for Biscuit, Honey, Duke, and Princess, for being used as mere pawns in a petty game. The audacity of Meghan and Philip was staggering. They were so accustomed to getting their way that they believed they could rewrite reality to suit them. But I knew the truth, and that truth, I promised myself, would be my defense. To defend myself properly, I needed irrefutable proof, documents that could unmask their charade. I knew that all the dogs' records, including their pedigrees and purchase contracts, were kept at Meghan and Philip's apartment. My former house, now theirs through my paternal generosity, was the only place I could find what I needed. I took a deep breath, straightened my tie, and set out. The apartment was in an upscale condo complex, a luxury I had provided for them. Upon arriving, I used the key I still possessed, a remnant of a time when I was always welcome. The door opened to a scene that shocked me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. It wasn't the organized, impeccable home I expected from my daughter, but rather a portrait of chaos. Papers were scattered across the living room, leftover food on the coffee table, clothes thrown on the couches. The smell of something old and musty hung in the air, a stark contrast to the freshness I tried to maintain in my own home. I began my search, methodically, ignoring the disarray, the emotional junk that filled the space. My focus was on the dogs' documents. I went through drawers, shelves, cabinets, every item I touched seeming to carry the weight of their irresponsibility. As I searched, my eyes fell on a pile of mail on Philip's office desk. Unpaid bills, electricity, water, gas, internet, credit cards, a hefty HOA fine for unauthorized renovations on the balcony was on top. A flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by a profound sadness. My allowance, which had once covered all these expenses, had dried up and they apparently had no financial control whatsoever. But what I found hidden in a locked drawer of Philip's desk was what made me stop, my heart pounding in my chest. A loan agreement, a bank loan for an astronomical amount, and most shockingly, they had used my property, the apartment that was in my name, as collateral, a clear case of fraud, a financial crime that left me stunned. The gravity of the situation was greater than I had imagined. It wasn't just about money or dogs, it was about a total lack of scruples. Bile rose in my throat. The definitive proof I needed, however, was in a leather portfolio I had given them years ago, a gift for organizing their important documents. I found it dusty, almost hidden under a pile of magazines. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside, along with the carefully preserved pedigrees of my four-legged grandchildren, was the original purchase contract from the breeder where I had acquired each of them. I remembered the breeder, a serious woman with an undeniable passion and love for her animals, and as if by a miracle, a vivid memory surfaced in my mind, her words echoing, a specific clause she had insisted on including, one that now seemed like a beacon in the darkness. In the event of proven abuse or neglect, ownership of the dogs would automatically revert to the original buyer, me. It was my legal loophole, my ultimate weapon. And Meghan and Philip were about to discover they had underestimated old James in a spectacular fashion. The revelation of this clause was a breath of fresh air, a glimmer of hope amidst the filth and betrayal. But, as always, life had a way of adding an extra layer of complexity, a surprise element that would make the next stage of this battle even more intriguing and decisive. With the breeder's contract in hand, the reversion of ownership clause seared into my mind, I felt a mix of relief and even greater determination. That document was the key to turning the tables, to exposing the farce and ensuring the safety of my beloved dogs. But it wasn't just legal proof I was after. I wanted to understand the extent of the neglect, the depth of Megan and Philip's disinterest. The conversation with Dr. Miller about Princess still echoed, and the mention of the breeder reignited a crucial memory. I needed to speak with her, confirm the details of the clause, and perhaps find out more about what had happened. I called the kennel, the number I kept in my old address book, a piece of paper yellowed with time. The breeder's voice, Miss Rossi, was as warm and friendly as I remembered. I introduced myself and, after a brief chat about the dogs, I explained the situation, my voice thick with emotion as I told her about Princess and the legal notice. Ms. Rossi listened intently, without interruption, and when I finished, there was a meaningful silence on the other end of the line. I sensed she had something to tell me. To my astonishment, and in confirmation of my worst suspicions, Miss Rossi told me that my son-in-law, Philip, had called her a few weeks earlier. Her tone was one of deep sadness and indignation. He was desperate, Mr. James. He said he wanted to sell the dogs, that they were too much work, and that he needed the money for an important trip. With each of Miss Rossi's words, another piece of the treacherous puzzle fell into place. It wasn't just neglect, it was a planned abandonment, an attempt to get rid of the animals to finance their pleasures, all while Princess suffered in silence from their lack of care. Hearing this from an outside source, from a woman who loved and cared for animals, confirmed what my heart already knew. Megan and Philip's coldness had no limits. They were willing to discard the dogs, the creatures I had entrusted to them, like objects. The news that Philip had tried to sell the animals, my grandchildren, just weeks before my birthday, before abandoning them on my doorstep, caused a lump to form in my throat. It wasn't just about money, it was about character, about the absence of compassion and loyalty. The shock was profound. But anger gave way to clarity. There was no more room for illusions, for foolish hopes of redemption. It was time to act. With the information from Mrs. Rossi and the documents in my possession, I began to prepare my counterattack. I was not a man of loud confrontations, but a patient strategist, accustomed to moving pieces with precision and silence. I organized the documents, the pile of Megan and Philip's unpaid bills, the HOA fine, the invoice for nearly 5 figures for Princess's veterinary treatment, the copy of the fraudulent loan agreement, and finally, the breeder's contract with the reversion of ownership clause highlighted in yellow. Each paper was a testament, irrefutable proof of their irresponsibility and bad faith. I patiently awaited their return from the beach. I knew the trip, with their cards declined and their allowance suspended, wouldn't be the paradise they had imagined. Frustration, anger, and resentment would be running high, and I was ready to face them. It was a decisive moment, a confrontation I didn't want, but knew was inevitable. I had to be strong, not just for myself, but for the dogs who depended on me for their protection and well-being. The day of their return arrived, and tension hung in the air of my home. I pictured them arriving, exhausted, frustrated, and likely full of accusations. I waited for them, seated in my favorite armchair in the living room, the documents carefully arranged on the coffee table, waiting for the right moment. My voice, I knew, would need to be firm, unshakable, with no room for doubt or hesitation. It was time to present them with the raw, unvarnished reality, the consequences of their choices. They arrived without warning, the door bursting open with a bang, and the energy radiating from them was pure fury. Megan, Philip, and Sylvia, all with contorted faces, their eyes flashing with anger, stormed into my house demanding explanations. "Dad, what do you think you're doing?" Megan yelled, her voice distorted by rage. It was the moment I had been waiting for. The time to reveal my hand and show them that I was not the weak, manipulable old man they had imagined. But the hardest part was yet to come, the final blow, the words that would seal the fate of our relationship irrevocably. I braced myself for the silence that would follow, for the shock that would overtake them, and for the pain that I knew would accompany that farewell. As I watched their furious faces, a strange calm washed over me. It was not the calm of victory, but of a profound sadness. The journey that had led me to this point had been arduous, full of disappointments and painful revelations, but I knew I was doing the right thing, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves and, perhaps, saving a piece of my own dignity. The next step would be the hardest, but also the most liberating. The fury of Megan, Philip, and Sylvia filled the room, echoing off the walls of the house that had once been a haven of so many joys. Their invasion was a reflection of their arrogance, of the belief that they had the right to demand and control. But in that moment, I was no longer the compliant father who yielded to every whim. I was James, the man who had built a legacy, and who would now use it to defend what was truly important. I looked at each of them, one by one, letting my eyes fix the truth onto their faces. "Dad, what do you think you're doing?" Megan shouted, her hands on her hips, her face red with indignation. Philip, beside her, seemed like her shadow, a silent echo of her anger, but with an evident nervousness in his eyes. Sylvia, always the mind behind the curtain, maintained an expression of superiority, her arms crossed, as if she were the judge of this scene. The air in the room was charged, thick with their anger and my own silent determination. I gave them a moment to exhaust their initial rage, for them to realize that their shouting would not have the desired effect. With the calm of someone who had planned every move, with a serenity that contrasted with the brewing storm, I placed the stack of documents I had meticulously prepared on the coffee table. There was no need for heated words, for verbal accusations. The facts would speak for themselves. First, I slid their pile of unpaid bills: electricity, water, gas, internet, credit cards, to the center of the table. At the top was the HOA fine for an alarming amount for unauthorized renovations. I watched their eyes, first with confusion, then with a hint of apprehension. They were so used to a life without financial responsibility that the sight of those bills was almost an affront. "Are these the hardships you were overcoming at the beach, Megan?" I asked, my voice low but laden with a biting irony. Next, I pushed forward the nearly 5-figure invoice for Princess's veterinary treatment. "And this, Megan, is the cost of your neglect, of the love you threw away, of the life you put at risk." Megan's eyes, once so full of anger, now widened slightly, a flicker of surprise, or perhaps something deeper crossing her face. Philip swallowed hard, his eyes fixed on the exorbitant amount. Sylvia, however, maintained her composure, but her lips tightened into a thin line. The next item was the copy of the fraudulent loan agreement. When I placed it on the table, Philip's and Megan's faces turned pale. Philip stammered, That's a mistake, Dad." But the look on my face gave him no room for excuses. The fraud on my property, the audacity of their actions, was there in black and white, an irrefutable testament to their dishonesty. Sylvia, for the first time, seemed to lose a bit of her composure, a slight tremor in her hands that she tried to conceal. The silence in the room was heavy, the tension almost palpable. And finally, with a deliberate movement, I slid the breeder's contract, with the reversion of ownership clause highlighted in yellow, to the center of the table. I remembered my conversation with Miss Rossi, of Philip's attempt to sell the dogs. And this, my dears, is the document that seals the fate of Biscuit, Honey, Duke, and Princess. My eyes met Megan's, and in them, for the first time, I saw not just anger, but a glimpse of fear. She was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation, the web they themselves had woven. "You have two options," I said, my voice as firm as ever, leaving no room for negotiation or emotional blackmail. "You sign this document, giving me permanent and legal custody of the dogs and disappearing from my life, and I forget about this fraud. Or we can settle this in court, where I guarantee you'll both walk away not only without the dogs, but also with a criminal record." The words echoed in the room, heavy and final. The game had changed, and they were the ones who were cornered. The air went out of them, as if a balloon had suddenly deflated. Sylvia, who until then had maintained a facade of control, tried to argue, her voice shrill. "This is absurd, James. You can't do this." But I simply raised a hand, silencing her with a cold glare. Philip stammered, trying to formulate some excuse, but the words just wouldn't come. It was the first time I had seen them so helpless, so devoid of their usual defenses. Megan, however, just stared at me, hatred burning in her eyes. In that moment, I saw that the filial love I had so long nurtured was completely extinguished. She finally understood that the game was over, that I would not back down. Her expression was one of defeat, but also of a contained rage, of a deep resentment. In a final act of spite, her voice laced with venom, she spat out the words that, paradoxically, became my liberation. "Keep the mutts. I never cared about them anyway." Her words were meant to wound me, to diminish me, but for me, they were a cry of freedom. The silence that followed her statement was more eloquent than any argument. The image of her departure, the sound of the door slamming, was like closing a bad book. There was no joy in my heart, only a profound relief, the peace that settles after a storm. I looked around. The house was no longer silent. It was filled with life, with the soft patter of paws on the floor, the warmth of furry bodies lying at my feet, their eyes looking at me with the innocence and unwavering loyalty that Megan had despised. I lost a daughter, but I gained a loyal family that would never abandon me on my birthday. And that trade, I decided, was the best deal of my life, a rebirth for a man who had found the true essence of love. But the journey wasn't over. The resolution of that conflict, though painful, was just the beginning of a new chapter in my life, a chapter I knew would bring different challenges, but also the promise of a peace and happiness I had forgotten existed. And as the dogs snuggled up to me, I felt that the real healing was just beginning to bloom. The door closed behind them, not with the dramatic slam Megan might have wanted, but with a dry, final click that sealed not just an argument, but an era. The silence that followed was not the painful emptiness of before, but a strange quiet, heavy with exhaustion and a deep sadness. I stood in the middle of the living room, the documents still spread across the coffee table, the echoes of Megan's last words still ringing in my ears. "Keep the mutts." I never cared about them anyway. That phrase, spoken with such disdain, should have hurt me more, but surprisingly, it brought a sharp clarity. It was as if, by uttering those words, she had severed the last thread that bound us. I looked at Biscuit, who came over and rested his muzzle on my hand, his brown eyes expressing unwavering loyalty. Honey, Duke, and Princess, now more lively and with her tail wagging tentatively, surrounded me. Their presence a balm for my wounded soul. I felt the warmth of their bodies against my legs, the soft sound of their breathing. They were my family now, a bond built not by blood, but by care, love, and a mutual need for companionship. In that moment, the legal victory over Megan and Philip felt hollow. I had won, yes, but at what cost? The lesson I had so desperately wanted to teach her. I wondered if she would ever even be capable of understanding it. And, more importantly, I realized that my own healing would not come from her defeat, but from building something new in my own life. The following days were ones of deep introspection. I cared for the dogs with even greater dedication. taking Princess for her follow-up appointments with Dr. Miller, who gave me encouraging news about her recovery. We would talk about the dogs, about the importance of responsible adoption, about the many stories of abandonment he witnessed in his clinic. In his every word, I saw the same passion and compassion I was beginning to feel more intensely. I found myself thinking about the empire I had built, about my entire fortune, which for so long had the sole purpose of securing my daughter's future. And now, what would its purpose be? One afternoon, while walking in the park with the dogs, watching them run and play with infectious joy, an idea began to blossom in my mind. It was not an idea of revenge, nor of retaliation. It was something much bigger, more meaningful. If Megan had despised the unconditional love these animals offered, perhaps I could channel my energy and resources to protect and support other beings who, like my dogs, were victims of neglect and indifference. I had fought to protect Biscuit, Honey, Duke, and Princess. Maybe it was time to extend that fight beyond the walls of my home. The peace I felt with the dogs was real, but something still unsettled me. The image of Miss Rossi, the breeder, and her sadness when she spoke of Philip trying to sell the animals, made me think. I had focused on Megan and Philip, on their ingratitude, but there was a universe of animals in need, of dedicated people fighting for them. This realization was an unexpected turning point. I, who had spent my life building my empire in the business world, now found myself with a new purpose, a path that involved not profits or stocks, but the generosity of spirit and care for the most vulnerable. True recovery, I began to understand, was not in punishing the wrong done to me, but in transforming the pain into a force for good. My lesson for Megan, while perhaps necessary for her to face the consequences, would not bring back what was lost between us. The real healing would be found in something deeper, more altruistic. The idea, still nascent, of how I would do this began to take shape. I had resources, knowledge, and most importantly, a new motivation. That night, sitting in my armchair with the dogs nestled around me, I looked up at the ceiling, at the silence filled with the sound of life. It was no longer the oppressive silence of before. It was a thoughtful silence, the prelude to a new beginning. I felt I was on the verge of embarking on a different journey, one that would take me to a place I had never imagined, and that would bring me the true emotional resolution I so craved. The Cold War was over, but a new adventure, full of purpose and renewed hope, was just beginning to unfold, and I couldn't wait to see where it would lead me and what new connections it would bring. The sunrise in the following days seemed different. It was no longer just the promise of a new routine, but of a new purpose. The idea that had sprouted in my heart while watching my dogs run through the park would not leave me. On the contrary, it took root, gaining strength and clarity with each passing hour. If I had built an empire for a daughter who did not know how to value it, I would now rebuild it, or rather redirect it, for those who truly needed it. The loneliness that once consumed me gave way to a sense of urgency, of something important to be done. The dogs, my four-legged angels, were the catalysts for this transformation. I started my research, something I hadn't done in years. I delved into books, articles, and documents on animal welfare, on the reality of shelters and non-profit organizations. I discovered a world of dedication and, at the same time, of profound needs. Many of these places struggled with few resources, relying solely on the goodwill of volunteers and small donations. The neglect my dogs had suffered was just a small reflection of a much larger and more painful reality. My heart, once hardened by disappointment, began to open up to this new cause. My first concrete action was to seek out Dr. Miller. I trusted him, not just as a veterinarian, but as a man of integrity and compassion. I scheduled a lunch at a small restaurant near his clinic, a simple and cozy place. He arrived with his usual kind smile, But I could see a curiosity in his eyes. During the meal, which passed with light conversation about Princess's recovery, I finally revealed my intentions. I described my idea of using my resources to support shelters, to create an emergency fund for rescued animals, and perhaps, one day, to build a sanctuary for elderly or special needs animals. Dr. Miller listened to me attentively, his eyes conveying a growing respect. When I finished, he put down his fork and looked at me seriously. "Mr. James, that's a noble initiative. I know the reality of many of these shelters. The passion and love are there, but the resources, those are always scarce. Your help would make an immense difference." His approval, coming from someone so connected to the cause, was fuel for my soul. He told me about a specific shelter on the outskirts of the city, called the Hopeful Paws Shelter, which was facing serious difficulties, on the verge of closing its doors for lack of funds. The stories of the animals housed there, many rescued from extreme situations, touched me deeply. My relationship with Dr. Miller deepened. He became not only my veterinarian, but a confidant and a valuable advisor on this new path. We started making plans, identifying priorities, thinking about how my empire could be restructured to serve this purpose. My home office, once a place of business and cold calculations, was now filled with papers on shelter budgets, spay, neuter projects, and education programs. The complexity of the challenges was enormous, but the motivation was even greater. However, not everything was a bed of roses. The transition from businessman to animal philanthropist brought its own difficulties. I had no experience in managing non-profits, in dealing with volunteers, in navigating the bureaucracy of permits and regulations. There were moments of doubt, of uncertainty, of wondering if I was really up to the task. I remember one night, sitting by the window, looking at the starry sky, feeling the weight of responsibility. But then, Honey, with her contagious energy, jumped into my lap, licking my face, and Duke, with his protective gaze, lay at my feet. They were my constant reminder of the why behind it all. Still, the shadow of my old life loomed over me in a way I hadn't expected. News about Megan and Philip, though less frequent, would arrive from time to time, brought by well-meaning friends who told me about the financial difficulties they were facing. My silence had hit them hard, and the luxury they considered an acquired right was unraveling. But this brought me no satisfaction, only a resigned sadness. I hoped that somehow they were learning, growing, but the information indicated otherwise. They just seemed angrier, more resentful, blaming me for their own choices. One day, as I was finalizing the paperwork for the initial donation to the Hopeful Paws Shelter, an envelope arrived with no return address, just my name and address. The material inside was not from a law firm, but a newspaper clipping from a local gossip column. The headline made me shudder, as it was another subtle attack on my reputation. A veiled attempt to undermine my new path. It was a short blurb about eccentric tycoons who, after family disagreements, seek redemption in noble causes to clean up their image. A clear jab, insinuating that my new dedication was just a sham, a facade to hide the unfolding family drama. I looked at the clipping, my heart tight. I knew the battle for the truth was far from over, and that the obstacles would not only come from a lack of resources, but from malice and envy disguised as concern. Someone, I knew, was trying to sabotage me, and I needed to find out who. The newspaper clipping, with its venomous words and malicious insinuations, was a cruel reminder that even on my new journey of altruism, the shadows of the past and the snares of envy continued to haunt me. I put the paper away, the image of the printed letters burning in my mind. Who would have sent that? And why? The answer seemed obvious, but I didn't want to believe that Megan or Philip would stoop to that level. My attention, however, needed to be focused on the Hopeful Paws Shelter, on the new purpose that drove me. Accompanied by Dr. Miller, I made my first official visit to the Hopeful Paws shelter. The facade was simple, a worn wooden gate and a low wall that barely hid the reality behind it. Upon entering, I was enveloped by a concert of barks and meows, a chorus of welcome that touched me deeply. The place, though clean and organized, revealed its scarcity of resources in every detail. The dog houses were makeshift, the communal areas were in urgent need of repair, and the few toys were old and worn. But what impressed me most was the unwavering dedication of the volunteers. I met Beatrice, the shelter's founder, a small woman with white hair and eyes weary with exhaustion, but with a strength and passion that radiated from every pore. She greeted me with a warm hug, her calloused hands conveying the story of a life dedicated to animals. "Mr. James, you don't know how much your visit means to us. We're fighting to keep our doors open." Her words, spoken with touching sincerity, reinforced my decision. Here, I saw the essence of what mattered: pure, selfless love. I spent hours at the shelter, listening to the stories of each rescued animal, seeing the care with which they were treated: a three-legged mutt, a blind cat, puppies abandoned in boxes on the side of the road. Every look, every touch was a reminder of why I was there. I felt an immediate connection with these vulnerable beings, a resonance with my own experience of emotional abandonment. The pain I had felt in some way connected me to them, allowing me to see the world through their eyes. My first donation, a substantial amount that secured the shelter's rent for many months and allowed for the purchase of food and medicine, was received with tears of gratitude by Beatrice and the volunteers. Seeing the relief on their faces, the hope rekindled in their eyes, was worth more than any profit my empire had ever brought me. But I knew it was just the beginning. My intention was not just to give money, but to build something lasting, something that could sustain the cause in the long term. I returned home that day with a lighter heart but a mind full of ideas. I began to draw up a plan to restructure a considerable part of my assets, creating a foundation for animal welfare. It would require time, effort, and a lot of bureaucracy, but I was determined. Dr. Miller offered to be on the board, and Beatrice, with her practical experience, would be an invaluable advisor. We were building a team, a purpose. As I immersed myself in this new project, news about Megan and Philip continued to arrive, now through indirect channels, as if the universe wanted me to know they were still around. Somehow, mutual friends would comment on their financial difficulties, on the sale of Philip's luxury car, on their move to a smaller apartment in a less affluent neighborhood. I knew that Sylvia, the mind behind many of Megan and Philip's actions, was feeling the blow even more acutely, as she was the one who benefited most from the luxury I provided. But I kept my distance, focused on my new path. One afternoon, by the pool, while Princess, now fully recovered, played with Honey, the doorbell rang. It was a courier with another manila envelope. My heart tightened, anticipating another malicious message. This time, the contents were more impactful. It wasn't a newspaper clipping, but a photograph. In it, Megan and Philip were sitting at a table in a modest cafe, and in the foreground was Sylvia, with a dark expression, speaking intently with a man I vaguely recognized. He was a journalist from a local tabloid, known for his sensationalist stories. The caption, handwritten on the back of the photo, read, "Preparing the next move." That moment hit me like a lightning bolt. Someone was orchestrating a campaign against me, and Sylvia's presence in the photo was clear proof. The Cold War was escalating, and I needed to be ready for the next attack, which seemed imminent and this time more personal. The peace I was beginning to find was about to be tested once more. The photograph and the handwritten caption were like a bucket of cold water, a shock that brought me back to harsh reality. It wasn't just about my daughter and son-in-law. It was about Sylvia, the mind behind the curtain, the orchestrator of manipulations. The sensationalist journalist in the photo indicated that the next attack would not be a mere whisper, but a media explosion designed to publicly discredit me. I felt a wave of anger, not for what they might say about me, but for the cowardice and malice of their actions, which seemed to have no limits. However, this time, I would no longer feel paralyzed. I discussed the photo with Dr. Miller, who was also concerned. He suggested I seek legal counsel, someone specializing in defamation and image rights. I, in turn, decided it was time to turn the tables, to use my own influence and resources to protect myself and, more importantly, to protect the Hopeful Paws shelter and the reputation of my future foundation. I needed to act with intelligence, not emotion. My first move was to approach a longtime friend, Robert Sterling, a respected lawyer with unquestionable ethics. I presented him with all the facts, the history with Megan, the issue with the dogs, the fraudulent loan, the social media posts, and finally, the photo of the meeting with the journalist. Mr. Sterling listened intently, his eyes narrowed in concentration. When I finished, he nodded, seriousness marking his face. James, this is a clear attempt at defamation and blackmail. We need to get ahead of this, not just react. Mr. Sterling advised me to document everything, every post, every threat, every insinuation. He helped me devise a strategy, not only to defend myself, but to expose the truth behind the intentions of Sylvia, Megan, and Philip. I didn't want a public spectacle, but I knew that if they insisted on turning the situation into a circus, I would have the tools to protect myself. While the legal side began to move, I continued my dedication to the Hopeful Paws shelter. My visits became more frequent, the connection with the animals and volunteers deepening with each day. I started organizing smaller fundraising events, talks on responsible pet ownership, and even helped renovate some of the dog houses, painting and building new shelters. That work, both manual and heartfelt, was a balm for my soul. Seeing the transformation of the animals from frightened creatures to confident, joyful beings was the greatest reward. The news of my dedication to the Hopeful Paws shelter began to spread, initially by word of mouth, then through small reports in local newspapers and on community news portals. The focus was always on the good being done, the lives being saved. Beatrice, with her natural charisma, was the perfect spokesperson, and Dr. Miller, with his credibility, validated every step. Slowly, the narrative that Megan and Philip were trying to build about me began to dismantle, replaced by an image of altruism and compassion. My four-legged grandchildren were my biggest cheerleaders. Biscuit, with his calmness, taught me patience. Honey, with her infectious joy, reminded me of the importance of enjoying every moment. Duke, with his unwavering loyalty, reinforced the value of faithfulness. And Princess, the little warrior who had overcome so much, was a symbol of resilience. They were my compass, my safe harbor in the storm. But the storm had not yet completely passed. One day, I received a call from Mrs. Peterson, my neighbor. Her voice was fraught with apprehension. James, I saw something. Megan and Philip are back in the neighborhood, and Sylvia is with them. The news caught me by surprise. They were back in town, and Sylvia's presence was a bad omen. I felt a chill. Something told me that the attack I had been expecting was about to materialize, and that it would be more direct and perhaps more painful than I had imagined. Mr. Sterling had prepared me for this. I knew the final confrontation was approaching, and that I needed to be ready to use all the tools at my disposal, not only to defend myself but to protect the legacy I was beginning to build. The serenity I had found was about to be tested, and I knew I would need all my strength and wisdom to face what was coming next. The board was set, the pieces in play, and the final move was about to be made. The news of Megan, Philip, and Sylvia's return to the city and their proximity to my neighborhood set off an alarm inside me. The calm I had been cultivating recently was replaced by a growing tension, the anticipation of an inevitable confrontation. I knew that after the veiled attempts and behind-the-scenes insinuations, the next stage would be a direct attack, perhaps a last-ditch effort to try to reclaim what, in their distorted minds, they believed they were entitled to. What I didn't expect was the form this attack would take. A week after Mrs. Peterson's call, while I was at the Hopeful Paws shelter supervising the construction of new kennels, I received a phone call from Mr. Sterling. His voice was urgent. "James, they've made their move. The journalist we saw in the photo published an extensive article in the tabloid. It's a heavy-handed smear campaign with absurd accusations and distortions of the facts." My heart sank, but I wasn't surprised. It was exactly what I had expected. The article, as Mr. Sterling described it, painted a dark picture of me. A cruel father who abandoned his own daughter, an eccentric magnate who used animal charity as a front to hide his sins, a lonely and bitter man who preferred the company of dogs to his own family. The words were chosen to wound, to discredit, to isolate me. They had twisted the story of the credit cards, the allowance, the apartment, turning me into the villain and them into the innocent victims of an old tyrant. Even Princess's health was mentioned, with the insinuation that I was the one truly responsible for her condition. I felt a surge of fury. The falsity of the accusations was revolting, and the cruelty of Megan and Sylvia in distorting the truth for the public was unspeakable. But at the same time, a strange calm washed over me. I was prepared for this. Mr. Sterling had already activated his team. "Don't worry, James. We are already preparing our legal response. We will file a lawsuit for defamation and libel, and we have all the evidence of their own fraud to use against them." The news of the article spread like wildfire. Friends and acquaintances started calling me, some concerned, others indignant. Mrs. Rodriguez, my housekeeper, came to my house with teary eyes, offering her support. Mrs. Peterson brought a coffee cake and words of encouragement. Dr. Miller, for his part, called to express his solidarity, and Beatrice sent me a message of support from the volunteers at the Hopeful Paws shelter. It was in that moment that I realized that although Megan and Philip had tried to isolate me, I was not alone. There was a network of people who believed in me, who knew my character, and who were willing to stand by me. The tabloid article, in a way, ended up bringing the Hopeful Paws community even closer together. Volunteers and donors, instead of distancing themselves, mobilized, expressing their outrage and reinforcing their commitment to the cause. They saw in me not the monster the article tried to paint, but a man who, despite personal difficulties, was dedicating his life to a greater purpose. This gave me immense strength, a confirmation that my path was the right one. While Mr. Sterling's legal team worked tirelessly, I dedicated myself even more to the dogs and the shelter. I transformed my anger and frustration into energy to work, to build, to prove, not with words, but with actions, who I really was. I spent most of my days at the Hopeful Paws shelter, not just as a benefactor, but as an active volunteer. I cleaned kennels, fed animals, played with puppies. The contact with those innocent beings and the dedicated volunteers was my refuge, my source of peace. It was during one of those afternoons at the shelter, while helping to socialize a traumatized puppy, that one of the volunteers, a young man named Peter, approached me. He seemed hesitant, but his eyes conveyed a touching sincerity. "Mr. James, I read the article. It's horrible, but you're not like what they say. You're here, working, caring for the animals. That's what matters." Peter's words, simple and true, hit me more deeply than any legal defense could have. It was the voice of the people, of common sense, of the truth that manifests in actions. However, the inner calm I felt was still permeated by the sadness of the situation with Megan. I couldn't understand how she had let herself be carried to such an extent, to the point of trying to destroy her own father's reputation. The hurt was deep, a wound I knew would take time to heal, but somehow the unconditional love of my dogs, the dedication of the volunteers, and the support of my friends were filling the void she had left. I was rebuilding my life, not from vengeance, but from resilience and compassion. But the game was not over yet. The article was just the prelude to a larger confrontation, and I knew that the true resolution, the complete healing, was still to come, and that it would demand a strength I didn't even know I possessed. I prepared myself for the next step, the moment when the truth would finally be revealed, not only to the public, but to those who had tried to silence me. And I knew it would be a moment of great tension, a conclusion that would forever change my life and the perception of everyone around me. The defamatory article in the tabloid sea, with its half-truths and blatant lies, had generated a wave of gossip. But to my surprise and relief, it did not have the effect that Megan, Philip, and Sylvia had hoped for. Thanks to my impeccable reputation, the testimony of my friends, and above all, the visible work I had been doing at the Hopeful Paws shelter, most people did not swallow the malicious narrative. On the contrary, many sympathized, and the shelter received a significant increase in donations and volunteers. Their attempt to bring me down had, paradoxically, strengthened my cause. Mr. Sterling and his team acted quickly, notifying the tabloid of the defamation lawsuit and Megan and Philip's lawyers of the fraud charges. The legal pressure was immense, and I knew they were cornered. Their fury, however, did not diminish, but rather transformed into desperation. I felt that the final confrontation was approaching, the moment when all masks would fall and the truth would finally be exposed, not just to the public, but to themselves. The date for the preliminary hearing was set. It wouldn't be a full trial, but a crucial stage where the parties would present their evidence and attempt mediation. I knew it would be a difficult, emotionally exhausting day, but I was ready. I was not seeking revenge, but justice. Justice for my dogs, for my reputation, and for the integrity of my name. On the day of the hearing, I arrived at the courthouse accompanied by Mr. Sterling. I wore a discreet suit, but my head was held high. The dogs, my guardian angels, stayed at home, but their spirits were with me. The building was imposing, its walls echoing the hurried footsteps of lawyers and an air of solemnity. In the hallway, I saw Megan, Philip, and Sylvia. They were visibly tense. Megan avoided my gaze, Philip looked pale, and Sylvia, though she tried to maintain her composure, had thin lips and nervous eyes. It was the first time we had seen each other since the confrontation at my house, and the atmosphere was heavy, charged with repressed emotions. The session began in a small room, an experienced mediator trying to calm the tempers. Mr. Sterling presented our evidence, the overdue bills, the fraudulent loan, the veterinarian's invoice with the diagnosis of Princess's neglect, the breeder's contract with the reversion of ownership clause, and, of course, the defamatory tabloid article. With each piece of evidence presented, Megan's face grew paler, and Philip mumbled inaudible excuses. Sylvia tried to intervene, but the mediator firmly silenced her. When it was Ms. Rossi, the breeder, her turn to give her testimony, the silence in the room was almost absolute. She recounted Philip's attempt to sell the dogs, his desperation for money for the trip, and her concern for the animals' well-being. Her voice was calm, but her words were a direct hit. Megan, for the first time, couldn't hold back her tears. They were not tears of remorse, I knew, but of humiliation and frustration. Then the mediator turned to me. "Mr. James, what is your intention with all this? What do you hope to achieve?" I took a deep breath, looking at Megan, at Philip, at Sylvia. My voice came out clear, without anger, but with an unwavering conviction. My intention, Your Honor, is to ensure the safety and well-being of the dogs, and that the truth be re-established. I am not seeking revenge, but for responsibility to be taken, and for my daughter and son-in-law to understand the weight of their actions, not just financially, but ethically. It was then that something unexpected happened, a turning point I could not have foreseen. As I spoke, and Megan wept silently, Sylvia, in a harsh voice filled with resentment, blurted out a sentence that revealed the true extent of her manipulation. "You ruined everything. Megan has always been mine. I raised her to have the best of everything, and you, with this obsession of yours with dogs, took it all away from her." The room fell silent. Her words, full of envy and possessiveness, exposed not only her own nature but the unhealthy influence she held over Megan. The mediator and even the lawyers were visibly shocked. Sylvia's declaration was a climactic moment, the final revelation of a truth I had always suspected but had never been so openly exposed. Those words were not for me, but for Megan, and in them I saw the pain and manipulation that had shaped her life. In that instant, I understood that the Cold War was not just between me and Megan, but also a silent battle for my daughter's soul. I was overcome with a deep sadness, but also with a strange sense of release. The real battle, I knew, was not legal, but emotional, and the resolution of it all was about to unfold in a way that would forever change the dynamics of our family and Megan's perception of herself. What would come next? I couldn't predict, but I knew it would be a watershed moment. Sylvia's outburst echoed through the room, a cry of possession and resentment that laid bare the true nature of her influence over Megan. The silence that followed was almost palpable, broken only by my daughter's stifled sobs. I watched her, her face contorted in a mixture of shame, anger, and perhaps for the first time, a hint of disillusionment. This moment wasn't about legal or financial victories. It was about the raw, unvarnished truth revealed on the stage of a hearing. I saw a flicker of recognition in Megan's eyes, as if her mother-in-law's words had finally broken through a wall of denial she had built over the years. The mediator, an experienced man, recognized the depth of the moment. He turned to Sylvia, his voice firm. "Mom, your statement is extremely relevant to these proceedings, but for now, I ask that you stick to the facts." The mother-in-law, visibly shaken by the repercussion of her own words, fell silent, but her gaze still carried the same envy and resentment. Philip, beside her, seemed even more insignificant, a mere puppet in a drama that was beyond him. In that instant, I looked at Megan. Her eyes met mine, and for a brief second I saw the little girl I had raised, the daughter I loved, before life and toxic influences had changed her. I felt a pang of pain, but also a deep compassion. She was trapped in a web of lies and manipulation, and her liberation, I realized, was as important as my own. The mediator resumed, suggesting a final effort at reconciliation. Given the evidence and testimony presented, I suggest the parties reach an agreement. Mr. James, what do you propose to resolve this matter? I had already discussed this possibility with Mr. Sterling. I no longer wanted to drag this battle through the courts. "My proposal is simple," I said, my voice calm but carrying an authority that came from years of experience in the business world. Megan and Philip will sign a legal document granting me permanent and irrevocable custody of the dogs, renouncing any rights to them. In return, I will drop the fraud charges related to the property, and I will terminate the defamation suit against the tabloid and, consequently, against them. Furthermore, I will propose a settlement that allows them to remain in the apartment for a period of 6 months, enough time for them to get organized and find a new place. During this period, the apartment's expenses will be their responsibility. After 6 months, the apartment must be vacated. The mediator presented the proposal to Megan and Philip's lawyers. At first, there was resistance, especially from Sylvia, who muttered something about blackmail, but Mr. Sterling intervened, reminding them of the fragility of their legal position and the criminal implications of the fraud. Their lawyers, realizing the seriousness of the situation, advised Megan and Philip to accept the proposal. Megan looked at me again, her eyes swollen with tears, but with a glimmer of something new, perhaps resignation, perhaps a belated recognition of reality. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. Philip, defeated, also agreed. Sylvia, with a heavy sigh, crossed her arms and turned her face away, but did not object. The documents were quickly drafted and signed right there, in the presence of the mediator and the lawyers. It was a solemn moment, the formalization of a rupture, but also the beginning of a new path for all of us. At the end of the hearing, as the parties stood up, I approached Megan. She seemed small, vulnerable. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a deep sadness. "Megan," I said, my voice soft, almost a whisper, "I always wanted what was best for you, and I hope, from the bottom of my heart, that one day you understand the true value of things, of loyalty, of unconditional love." She didn't reply, just lowered her head, and I saw a single tear roll down her cheek. It was a small hope, a sign that perhaps the seed of reflection was being planted. Watching them leave the courthouse, their steps heavy and without their former luster, was like closing a book, but a book that had taught me valuable lessons. The resolution of the main conflicts, though painful, brought a sense of closure, of an ending. I had not regained a daughter, but I had regained myself. The transformation in my life was evident, and the path I was carving of altruism and compassion filled me with a sense of purpose I had never known before. The weight I carried in my chest, the deep sadness of disappointment, began to dissipate, giving way to a feeling of peace, the end of one cycle and the beginning of another, full of purpose and new hopes, was just beginning. Leaving the courthouse after signing the documents marked the end of an era and the beginning of a new chapter in my life. The image of Megan with her head bowed, the single tear rolling down her face, stayed with me. It was a mix of sadness for what we had lost and a faint hope that she might one day see the truth. The legal battle was over, and I had secured the safety and well-being of my dogs, but the real victory, I knew, was in the peace I was finally finding in my own heart. I returned home, where Biscuit, Honey, Duke, and Princess greeted me with festive barks and wagging tails. Their eyes, full of joy and unconditional love, were the greatest balm for the soul. The house, once a place of silence and solitude, was now filled with life, with the pitter-patter of paws on the floor, of curious noses, and of hearts beating in unison with mine. I shared my dinner with them, each piece of food offered with the affection that only someone who truly loves can understand. That day taught me that family isn't just about blood, but about those we choose to love, care for, and protect. In the months that followed, I dove headfirst into the Foundation project. With the tireless help of Dr. Miller and the wisdom of Beatrice, the James Foundation for Animal Welfare took shape. My empire, once focused on accumulating wealth, now had a much nobler and more gratifying purpose: to protect the vulnerable, care for the forgotten, and spread love and compassion. I invested a significant portion of my fortune in building a model sanctuary for rescued animals, a place where they could live in peace and safety, receiving the care and love they deserved. The sanctuary became a refuge, not just for the animals, but for me as well. I spent most of my days there, working side by side with the volunteers, who became my new friends, my new family. I learned to handle orphan puppies, to calm frightened dogs, and to care for elderly cats. Each animal had a story, and I saw myself in each of them, a being that had been hurt but found healing in love and dedication. The laughter of the children who visited the sanctuary, the joy of the volunteers seeing an animal recover, all of it filled my life with a meaning I had never imagined. my relationship with Dr. Miller grew stronger. He was a pillar of support, a friend and advisor at every stage of the foundation. Beatrice, with her experience and unwavering passion, became the director of the sanctuary, her contagious energy inspiring everyone. The story of Old Man James, who traded a daughter for mutts, became a legend, but one of altruism and resilience. The local media, once used to defame me, now published inspiring reports about the Foundation's work, about the lives we were saving, and about the power of compassion. The 6 months passed quickly, and Megan and Philip vacated the apartment. I heard they had moved to another state, seeking a fresh start. I had no further direct contact with them, but I received sporadic news that they were facing challenges, learning one way or another the lessons I had so wanted them to understand. Sylvia, I learned, had also distanced herself, losing the influence she once wielded. I felt no joy in their difficulties, only the hope that one day they might find their own path to redemption. My life, at 72, was fuller and more meaningful than ever before. There was no more emptiness, no oppressive silence. There was Biscuit's joyful bark, the soft meow of a rescued cat, the warm hug of a volunteer. I had lost a daughter, but I had gained a much larger family, on 4 legs and 2, united by love and compassion. And that trade, I decided, was the best deal of my life. I had found true happiness, not in accumulated wealth, but in the richness of the heart, in the capacity to love and to make a difference in the lives of the beings who needed it most. As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, I sat on the porch of my sanctuary with my 4 dogs nestled at my feet. The air was cool, filled with the scent of wet grass and of life. I looked up at the starry sky, feeling the gentle breeze on my face. My heart was at peace. The journey had been long and painful, full of disappointments and unexpected revelations. But I had overcome, I had learned, I had transformed. And, in the end, I discovered that a true empire is not built of money or power, but of love, loyalty, and the ability to extend a hand to those most in need. And that, I knew, was the most beautiful legacy I could ever leave.